So this is an opportune moment, I think, to be having this discussion, because we've all just witnessed earlier this week the government's attack on nurses, a mostly female workforce, many of them immigrants, with the offer of a 1% pay rise during the biggest national health crisis in decades, if not a century. The pay rise amounts to £3.50 a week for a senior nurse. But as one senior nurse has said, it isn't even enough to cover the parking charges that staff have to pay for coming into work. In fact, it's effectively a pay cut if you take inflation into account. And the Royal College of Nursing is arguing that nurses should be getting a 12.5% pay increase instead. So it's good news that they are preparing for possible strike action over the offer, and more unions just today, Unite, British Medical Association and the Royal College of Midwives, might join them. The government, in its usual despicable way, has said that this is all they can afford. And of course, that's not true. So this struggle, and I hope we can all get behind this struggle when and if they do call a strike, immediately poses the question of how women in the NHS and in the wider public sector organize to fight for equality and an overhaul of our working conditions. And I think one of the things that's crucial in the movements today is how they draw on, and in many cases are rooted in, the history of working class women's organization. And I wanted to provide a bit of a feel for that history, including some of the lives of socialist women, and argue that we need to reclaim some of that history, some of that struggle, and see how they answered some of the same questions in order to understand how those struggles might be relevant for today. So it was 111 years ago that International Women's Day was first proposed in 1910 by socialist women, including Clara Zetkin, at the International Socialist Women's Conference in Copenhagen. They were inspired by American socialists who organized a demonstration the previous year to commemorate the 1908 protest of 15,000 women garment workers in New York who were demanding shorter working hours, better pay, voting rights, and an end to child labor. Most countries now celebrate and commemorate International Women's Day, including the UN, but its origins are firmly within the socialist tradition. And it was about striking. The following year, in 1909, there was another strike called the Uprising of the 20,000, led by a woman called Clara Lemlich, a Ukrainian-born working-class Jewish immigrant who became one of the leaders of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union established in 1900. Famously, after listening to speeches from union officials for several hours at a mass meeting in November 1909, she asked to speak, and she said the following: "I have listened to all the speakers, and I have no further patience for talk. I am a working girl, one of those who are on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. What we are here to decide is whether we shall or shall not strike. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared now." At 23, she then led over 20,000 workers, the vast majority of them Jewish women, on a strike the very next day. That strike lasted 11 weeks and set off a wave of other strikes across the country. And they won most of their demands: widespread contracts, a 52-hour week, 4 paid holidays per year, and the ability to negotiate wages. And by the end of the strike, 85% of all shirtwaist makers in New York had joined the union. And although they also won promises that trade unionists wouldn't be discriminated against, Lemlich was eventually blacklisted from the industry and increasingly grew to be at odds with the conservative union leadership. She then devoted her energies to the campaign for women's suffrage, as did many socialist women at the time, with the aim of bridging political demands for the vote, on the one hand, with economic demands and the demands of many working class women. There were many different groups that came together around women's suffrage in the 19th and 20th centuries, and there were big debates within this movement. There were those who were calling for the vote on the same terms as men, so on the basis of owning property, and they saw Parliament as the key focus for campaigning efforts. There was also the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, formed in 1903 and led by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, which focused on militant direct action, smashing windows, setting fire to post boxes, and going to prison and being force-fed while on hunger strike. Emily Wilding Davison, who was also a member of the WSPU, made the ultimate sacrifice. She threw herself in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby in 1913 and died of her injuries. Many of the women involved in the suffrage movement were middle and upper class women. There were also thousands of working class women who wanted the vote, but who also made immediate connections between the political demand and what the vote meant for participation in political and public life and their own economic reality. They knew that the vote was important, but that its value lay in opening up a struggle that could transform their living and working conditions. Sylvia Pankhurst, who came to organize the East London Federation of Suffragettes, ultimately split with the WSPU along these very lines. In 1911, she was on tour in America speaking about the book that she had published about the suffrage movement, a book that recounted the history of the movement according actually to the official WSPU line before she broke from it. But there she met many women factory workers, she visited prisons, she even traveled to the South and visited Native American reserves. Whereas the WSPU saw no connection between the struggle of oppressed groups and the vote, Sylvia began to see the need to unite the labor and the suffrage movements. The WSPU increasingly saw the vote as the panacea and more important than strikes. And this stemmed from their middle class, from their view that middle class educated women, as opposed to working class women, should lead the suffrage movement because working class women couldn't bear the stresses and strains of the suffrage battle, as they had argued it. On the other hand, the vital question for Sylvia became how to respond to working class women's concerns. And she began to draw the conclusion that the working classes could organize their own emancipation and that the vote was instrumental towards wider struggles, not an end in itself. She depicted the suffragettes as being on the side of the poor, and she sought to establish campaigns beyond the vote, including with trade unions. She defined essentially the movement in class terms. And this question was posed most forcefully at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. While the WSPU leadership immediately dropped the demands of the suffrage campaign when the war broke out, they suspended militant action and they backed the government in the war effort, Sylvia became fiercely anti-war. She later recalled that peace and the popular government of the world to end this capitalist system of ruthless materialism stood out for me as the two great needs of the hour. And in developing this internationalist, anti-imperialist perspective against national interests, she kept the focus on the defense of working class interests during the war. And here she was on a par with other communists of the time. Clara Zetkin, the German Marxist revolutionary and one of the leaders of the women's movement in Germany and the editor of the SPD women's newspaper, also explicitly opposed what she called bourgeois feminism and was critical of strategies that ignored the question of class. In fact, she argued that feminism as a multi-class movement and Marxism that centered working class politics were incompatible. Working class women had to organize separately within socialist parties alongside working class men. In other words, social transformation was not going to be brought about on the basis of sex, as if women of all classes had some common interest, but it was going to be brought about on the basis of the class struggle. And so women's liberation would be achieved through political power by the working class as a whole. Moreover, Zetkin maintained that Marxism and feminism had distinct theoretical foundations. While feminism drew inspiration from the bourgeois revolutions, Marxism was based on the historical materialist method. And Zetkin pressed the Second International to take a position on the question of female labor in the fight for socialism. At a speech delivered to the International in 1889, she said, "Working women are absolutely convinced that the question of the emancipation of women is not an isolated question which exists in itself, but part of the great social question. They realize perfectly clear that this question can never be resolved in contemporary society, but only after a complete social transformation." And of course, that meant continuing her work on ensuring women's participation in the labor force and the ability to organize in trade unions in order to improve their own conditions. So reforms around women's issues were necessary and crucial, but had to be embedded in the fight for socialism, or else those reforms could just be reversed in the future. And so the question as well of the war for Zetkin was crucial. She drew attention to the fact that only a tiny elite were profiting from the war and that workers had nothing to gain from it. Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, and others split from the SPD over its support for the First World War, and they rejected the policy that workers should refrain from striking during the war. And though they were in a minority, they certainly weren't alone. People like Alexandra Kollontai, another Marxist revolutionary from Russia, who remained consistently against the First World War, she officially joined the Bolsheviks in 1917 and wrote about the causes of the war and appealed to soldiers to fight their class enemies at home. And like Zetkin, she pointed to the fact that it's capital that benefits at the expense of workers who produce the goods, and that really the working classes of every country have to destroy their own capitalists. That would be the basis for working class solidarity across national boundaries. Kollontai also believed that women's equality in the legal and political spheres was limited if it was not part of the wider class struggle. Again, like other socialists, she argued that cross-class alliances were going to be limited. In her 1909 book, The Social Basis of the Woman Question, she wrote, "Class instinct, whatever the feminists say, always shows itself to be more powerful than the noble enthusiasms of above-class politics. So long as the bourgeois women and their proletarian younger sisters are equal in their inequality, the former can, with complete sincerity, make great efforts to defend the general interests of women. But once the barrier is down and the bourgeois women have received access to political activity, the recent defenders of the rights of all women become enthusiastic defenders of the privileges of their class, content to leave the younger sisters with no rights at all. Thus, when the feminists talk to working women about the need for a common struggle to realize some general women's principle, women of the working class are naturally distrustful." For Kollontai, women's liberation was far from a secondary question. And she argued that the Revolutionary Party has to organize and relate to women as part of the working class. And though she herself was from an upper class background, her political education was formed through learning about factory conditions during the women's textile workers' strikes of 1896. And she was perhaps one of the first revolutionaries, drawing on her readings of Marxism, including August Bebel's 1879 book, Woman and Socialism, to argue that even if women worked outside the home, they still had huge amounts of unpaid work to do within the home, which was not socialized. And the institution of marriage and the family worked to contribute to women's oppression. She was vociferous in her support for Lenin's call for all power to the Soviets. And when she was appointed Commissar for Welfare during the revolutionary government after the Russian Revolution, she was the only female member of the Bolshevik government. She instituted radical legislation, famously, right, around facilitating divorce, legalizing abortion and homosexuality, and free public childcare. She believed that only collective child rearing and socialization of domestic work could help women exercise economic independence and autonomy. And later, when she helped establish the Zenitdel, the Women's Department of Government in 1919. She was working specifically to implement and enforce that legislation. And so many of these ideas that the early socialist women developed in practice came explicitly or implicitly from the work of Marx and Engels, including and especially Engels's the origin of the family, private property, and the state. The theoretical foundations of Marxism were crucial. Zetkin wrote in 1903 that it was only the materialist conception of history which enabled us to understand the women's question within the flux of universal historical development. In other words, if we saw history as changing and changeable, then the position of women in the family and society could also change. The position of women was based on the prevailing economic conditions and the property relationships that resulted from them. And because the working classes have no property and therefore no interest in property, they are the class that have the power to overthrow those prevailing economic conditions. Moreover, the institution of the family itself could be transcended with the overthrow of property relations, because I mean, the way production was organized in the early days of the development of modern industry and so on, where women and children were also often working, Zetkin wrote that the working class family no longer had anything in common with bourgeois family relations. And in this sense, it could create the economic basis for a higher form of the relationship between the sexes. So although many of the early socialist women had an analysis of racism, nationalism, and of course sexism, apart from the question of class, they very much did, they maintained that the central focus for the overthrow of capitalism must be a class perspective. Zetkin wrote approvingly of Marx and Engels' work in 1909, when she said, in theory and practice, they maintain the conviction that the class antagonisms are much more powerful, effective, and decisive than the social antagonisms between the sexes, and that thus the working class women will never fully win their emancipation in a struggle of all women without difference of class against the social monopolies of the male sex, but only in the class war of all the exploited without difference of sex against all those who exploit without difference of sex. And again, the focus of activity, including women's suffrage, for all those decades, would be a weapon, a means of struggle for a revolutionary aim. Eleanor Marx certainly took this seriously in her writing on the women's question, and like Zetkin, also argued that the advancement of women through suffrage would be limited if it didn't also address the economic basis of society. And true to the classic formation in the Communist Manifesto, when she published her pamphlet on the woman question, she argued also that both the oppressed classes, women, and the immediate producers must understand that their emancipation will come from themselves. And this, of course, informed her work with the emerging trade union movement in the 1880s, her support for the match girls strike, and her work with the dock strike and the gas workers strike. She had a deep knowledge of the factory system, working conditions, and the legislation, and so on. And all of this knowledge helped her to argue as well for principled positions around anti-imperialism and anti-war throughout her life, and of course against nationalist sentiments in Britain's colonial conquests, of course, that had come to the fore at the time. And so while the socialist tradition of organizing women established in this period spread all over the world, and its legacy, I think, remains relevant. Subsequent women's movements have come up against the same questions: how to organize within wider movements that include middle-class women, but also how to organize as revolutionaries, how to ensure that women's issues are not relegated to becoming secondary questions, and how to work in the context of racism, nationalism, and the far right. If we fast forward to the 1960s, people like Angela Davis were working tirelessly to bring those different movements together, while also trying to theorize the intersection between women's liberation, race, and class. And we know the story of Angela Davis in getting arrested, becoming an international an icon, and really seeing how the US establishment was threatened when these movements against capitalism were brought together. When these movements were brought together, because they could pose a threat to capitalism. And of course, there have been amazing strikes in very recent history that draw these connections, not always at the outset. The Grunwick and Dagenham strikes in this country set the foundations for equal pay and the place of migrants within working class struggle. But certainly some people within those strikes begin to draw these conclusions, during the strike, during the experience of the strike itself, that a series of reforms are crucial, but will always be limited while the relationship of exploitation remains in place. So obviously much has changed. It's still the case that women overwhelmingly work in the public sector, over 2/3 according to the Women's Budget Group, overwhelmingly are underpaid. We still have a gender pay gap of 15.5%. And how we respond to this inequality is crucial. We need a movement that is relevant and can see how the struggle for equality has to be based on working class organization between women and men, and ultimately has to have the aim of moving beyond a series of reforms. So if this 1% pay offer to the nurses is essentially an act of class struggle by the British state, then I think it has to be answered by class struggle.